So we start all the interviews by asking our interviewees to just introduce themselves. So a little bit of background. So your name, your date of birth, your title, and then a little bit about your background, your upbringing, that sort of thing.
Okay, I'm Timothy Tackett, retired professor of history, French history at the University of California, Irvine. I was born August 30th, 1945. What else?
What sort of upbringing did you have? Did you come from what sort of family did you have? What sort of education did you have?
I was from very much a working class background. My father ran what we called in America a junkyard. It was an auto dismantling yard. So, and I worked in a factory to put myself through school. Yeah, so I'm a working class kid. And scholarship. I went through the university on scholarships, right, nearly the whole time. Although I did also work in a steel factory 3 summers. So yeah.
Okay, and would you say that politics was a big issue when you were growing up in your family? Did you have political discussions?
Not very much. No, not very much. My father and mother probably were New Deal Democrats, but had glided more toward the Republican Party over the years, and was brought up in basically a liberal Republican milieu. Yeah. I did not personally take part in politics in high school. As an undergraduate in college, I was very interested in the civil rights movement. And I went to lectures and read a lot about it, although I never marched. Not much was happening in California in terms of the civil rights movement. I followed toward the end of my undergraduate years, I began following the war in Vietnam and the protests against the war in Vietnam. But again, I did not participate very much before I went to France.
So you wouldn't describe yourself as being politically active or militant?
No. Or certainly as an outsider. And during my year in France, during 1967, 68, I thought of myself pretty much as an outsider.
Okay, so can you explain what brought you to France then during this period?
I had a Fulbright fellowship to the University of Poitiers, and I was there. Well, I was in France from September to September 1967 to 68. And I was assigned to Poitiers basically because I had originally wanted to study medieval history. And there's a great medieval center for medieval studies there. But over the summer, I'd changed. I decided I wanted to do 18th century studies, old regime, French Revolution. And so I spent much of my time in Poitiers in auditing courses by Jean Aigret. Jean Aigret is one of the great writers, scholars of the pre-revolution of late 18th century, the early French Revolution. And I learned a great deal from him. He was an elderly teacher at that time, had been in World War I believe. But I went to all of his classes. Poitiers, as you may know, was at that time a kind of backwater. It's become pretty active in the last 20 years, but at that time it was very bourgeois. It was off the beaten tracks, more or less. It was an administrative center, it was a market center, but it had no industry to speak of. And above all, it had this university, which is an old university. But the students came primarily from Western France, so from Anjou and Brittany and Poitou, even from the Vendée. So they were not very committed, they were not very active students. It was a pretty quiet place for the most part in 68. As I can tell you later, I traveled around and saw some other more active centers, events that year.
And had you spent any time in France prior to this period?
I'd spent a semester abroad in France, about 5 or 6 months, in Dijon and Paris, when I was, about 20 years old, a couple of years before. I knew French pretty well by then, so I could make my way around and I could chat with people, and that was a big advantage.
And what did you make of the French university system then?
I did have a lot, we did talk a lot with the kids in Poitiers, although they weren't really very active politically. It was clear they had a lot of problems. It was tough. It was a tough life. The dorms were pathetic. Classes were very large. Their professors were only there a few hours or maybe a day and a half a week. There wasn't much contact. There were, the problem of careers, of débouché, all of this was, I perceived as a real problem. And the exam system, I knew a lot of, I had a lot of friends, and it was very clear that there was that big exam at the end of the year for each class, and you either failed or you succeeded. And there was a young man studying law next door to me in a place I rented. And that was it. It was his first year of law studies. And I can't remember, it was something like 10% of the students got through after that first year's exam. It was really tough. And so there was tremendous pressure, and it seemed very unfair. And so the students, although they, again, in Poitiers, there was not much going on, it did seem like a difficult life. The concours, the système de concours. There were, I went to the cours d'agrégation, very interesting. But it was well known that if one student a year from Poitiers got the agrégation, that was amazing. All the agrégation, those who succeeded were in Paris. You had to go to Paris to go on with the career or to get into the grandes écoles. So, yeah, it was tough.
And sorry, how old were you then? I forgot to do that.
Yeah, how old was I then? I think I was 21 or 22.
Okay, and was there any, before things kick off, was there any sense that something was coming, or did the events actually come as a surprise?
It came as a pretty big surprise. I listened to the radio every morning in my room and vaguely was aware of things going on in Nanterre and in Paris itself. But students, in my experience, were always unhappy with something or other, and were always demonstrating. I never took it very seriously at first. And then I took a trip to the Soviet Union, what was then the Soviet Union, with a student youth group, a leftist student youth group. And it was when I came back that I really began to see that things, pretty massive changes were taking place. That this was becoming big. I was quite amazed. The first thing I remember was when I was in one of Jean Aigret's classes, and a young woman came in and asked if she could speak in the middle of the lecture, and she encouraged all of us to go on strike. And Jean Aigret waited patiently, and then he said, "Merci, mademoiselle." She walked out, and he continued his lecture. But, then things really began to shut down. They succeeded in closing even the University of Poitiers. Trains stopped, buses stopped, and flights stopped, and the post office closed down, and the phones didn't work very well, and television programming became really reduced. The whole world was closing down. It was an amazing event. It really came home to us as students when the student restaurant closed. And then, that was serious. And it was at that point that a lot of my French friends went home. I mean, just went home, and it seemed pretty clear there'd be no exams that year, and they went back. And it really was only the foreign students that were left to kind of fend for themselves.
And in terms of that sort of in the build up to the events, outside of the obvious problems that the university system in France was experiencing, was there any sense that things were changing more generally, and I mean internationally as well, because there are a lot of things going on around the world, and you've mentioned your trip to the former Soviet Union. Was there any others? So the civil rights movement in America, was there any sense that even as an international student you would have had a different perspective on?
Yeah, not Poitiers was Poitiers. There was not a lot going on in Poitiers at first. Yeah, I was aware, personally, I was aware of student movements going on around the world. Sure, I read the newspapers, things going on in, I guess by that time, in Berkeley and in Colombia and in Germany. But I was an outsider, and I cultivated the idea of being an outsider. I actually hitchhiked a lot around France that year for various reasons, to see friends and so on. And I'm pretty good at interviewing people. And this is what I did when I was picked up by some person. And I heard an amazing diversity of views. I was picked up by, long-haired anarchists in Chicago, and I was picked up by monarchists in Mercedes. And I would get them all to talk and get their opinions. And it was just stunning how divided the country was, what a diversity of opinions there was. And, but again, I did not see, and nobody I knew really saw this coming outside of Paris, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the cliches of 68 is this idea that there was the emergence of what has been called a generation conflict, sort of older people with their old archaic system versus a new, younger generation that's perhaps starting to agitate, and this could be seen through music, clothes, cultural things as well. Was there any sense of that generational conflict in your experience?
Oh, sure. I did spend some time in Paris, after all. And of course, yeah. When you talk to friends there in Paris, there was a big divide, and especially when I was talking to these folks hitchhiking around, you could see a huge difference, and you wondered where all this was going. But you also wondered if it had ever been any different than this. I wasn't a student of modern France. I really was a student of medieval and early modern France, but we knew about the long history of divisions, the long history of struggle, of revolutions, revolts, whatever. So it was hard to assess for me at the time if this was anything different, if this was really anything different. There was more talk about, I think the sexual liberation was a big deal for a lot of young people, and there was a lot of talk about this. There wasn't very much talk about women's liberation, I think. And my wife, who was there also, often complains that women were just kind of shunted aside during this whole experience, and that the women's movement in France really took off afterwards. And I think that's probably the case in many parts of the world. In those early days of student revolts, it was a male thing, and the women just kind of tagged along behind. Yeah.
So would you like to tell me how you started to realize that something was happening, and then what you did, how you started to get involved?
I never really got involved, as you say, in the sense of militating actively. I'll tell you what happened. As Poitiers shut down at one point, I went with one of my Japanese friends who had a car and somehow found some gas down to Bordeaux. And there was a riot, and I watched a riot right in the middle of the city. As an observer, you know. And I stood for a while behind the CRS at one side of the central plaza and watched these guys who were all really scared. And they were mostly older guys and didn't really, I think, know what was going on. And there were older men up on top of one of the buildings, I think it was the city hall, chucking cobblestones down into the street from high above that were really scary. I mean, this could have killed someone. Fortunately, nobody died. Then I walked around the other side on the student side and chatted with them a while and watched them protesting and charging at once the CRS. And then the tear gas started. And the police charged down across the square, and we all ran in every direction. And, I ran with everybody else. I came back and picked up a spent tear gas canister, which I still have on my shelf here somewhere. That was sort of my extent of my experience in a riot in '68. But I remember I hitchhiked back to Poitiers from Bordeaux and was picked up by a young soldier who was going back to his base. And he was really nervous and uneasy about the whole situation. And he talked about civil war. He said he was afraid of a civil war. And that stunned me as a historian and knowing about what happened in France in 1848 and 1871. This was really sobering. I went back to Poitiers, and my friend, roommate, or housemate, I guess, a young law student, invited me one day to come to a lecture. He said it was a lecture on American foreign policy. So I said, okay, let's go to this lecture. This was in the middle of May sometime. And when I got out and joined his friends, it was pretty clear I'd fallen in with a group of sort of fascist youth or far-right youth. They were all dressed in their uniforms. They had, black leather jackets, and they all had leather gloves and were carrying clubs. Each one had a little club. And so we went to this meeting, which turned out to be a tirade against communism, praise of the American intervention in Vietnam. So after a few minutes, I walked out. I'd gone out of friendship to this young man who had been very kind to me and at one point taken me into his family. This was clearly not my thing. And then a little bit later, I had to go to Paris. Two of my very best friends were getting married in the middle of all this, toward the end of May. And I had to get there. And so I started hitchhiking once again. It was not easy because there was not a lot of gas, there were a lot of cars on the road. It was mainly picked up by delivery vans and people going very locally. Finally got a ride with some guy coming up from the south who had this trunk whose boot was full of petrol canisters. And so he had enough to get himself to Paris and back, or maybe he was going further north, I don't remember. And he dumped me off at the Porte de Saint-Cloud. And I had to walk across Paris, of course. There was no metro, no buses. And went to my hotel in the middle of Latin Quarter. And I got to the wedding, and there weren't a lot of people. A lot of the friends had not been able to make it from the provinces. And I remember that the gift for the young couple was, 30 or 40 liters of petrol, so they could get to the Belgian border and spend their honeymoon in Belgium. And after that, I spent several days in Paris and wandered around, roamed through the Sorbonne, which was an amazing place in those days, full of students, meetings everywhere, flags and posters, and kids passing out pamphlets of all kinds. I was looking for Jean-Paul Sartre, whom I was told was often there, but I never found him. And I went out into the Boulevard Saint-Michel, and it was amazing, there was no traffic, and there were discussion groups right in the middle of the street, and guys in coats and ties were arguing with long-haired kids from the Sorbonne, and really interesting, and I think probably useful discussions. People were getting together. People were talking it over. And I did take part in one big demonstration. I don't remember the date, and I've discussed with friends which demonstration this actually was, but I remember going from the right bank to the left bank, and I thought it was from Denfert-Rochereau to the Place de la République. And I remember at the Place de la République hearing Danny Cohn-Bendit and Jacques Sauvegeau speaking, and some other of the student leaders, and I think there may have been some worker leaders. No women. Yeah. And then we went home. It was a joyous march, at that point anyway. I'm very enthusiastic. Lots of banners and posters and chants. À bas le gouvernement gaulliste, antipopulaire, de chantage, de chômage et misère, or de Gaulle fasciste, things like this. They were shouting.
What did you think of all that? Did you think it was serious, or did you think it was all?
I thought it was very serious. I always felt as an outsider. And one other thing that happened in that demonstration, we walked through a more bourgeois neighborhood, and a woman came out on her balcony waving a French flag, and she started screaming the Marseillaise, which I presume was considered something that the kids in the street would not sing. I don't know. And what did I think of it? I was amazed. It was an amazing experience. It was something I'll never forget. It was really I wouldn't say formative, but of all the experiences in my student years, I think that may be the one I remember best of all.
Yeah. And would you say that as a foreign student, it was difficult for you to fully become involved, and you were therefore more of an observer, or were there possibilities to become involved?
I'm sure I could have become involved. I think I could have, but I didn't. I had this American government fellowship. I felt a little uneasy about joining in too much. I don't know. And it wasn't my thing. I was delighted to talk with people and learn from them and trying to figure out what was going on, but not to really become engagé myself. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to ask you some more specific things that you may or may not have an opinion on. So one of the things that you briefly mentioned there was, and that is often one of the big debates in 68, is the idea that the students had attempted to create some sort of connection with the working class. Is that something that you saw, that you experienced, that worked, you saw working or didn't work?
In that big demonstration I marched in, I don't remember seeing any workers. So mainly young people, students, maybe other citizens, but nobody that was obviously a worker. That's just my memory. And the memory of the speeches was that they were basically student speakers. So, we were following that very closely at the Times, and the newspapers weren't published, but we heard on the radio, and we could hear on the foreign radios. Could the student and the workers really get together? We followed that, and it seemed like it was not working very well. I mean, they had some of the same grievances, of course. They felt they were being kept out of the system, that they wanted more concertation in their classes or in their factories. There were students, this is all well known to history, and there's not much that I can add. But in my personal experience, especially living in this non-industrial town of Poitiers, this was not a theme that I became very much aware of, except in the, in the media, such as it was at that time.
Okay, another interesting and connected debate around 68 is that there's often an accusation that there's an overemphasis on Paris as and to the detriment of coverage elsewhere in France at the time. As someone who experienced it in the regions, was there a sense that this was a Parisian event, or was it seen and felt to be more of a nationwide revolt?
It was really a Parisian event, as far as I could see. Certainly, nothing much in Poitiers. I never saw even a demonstration in Poitiers. They were passing out pamphlets sometimes, and they did succeed, as I said, in closing down the university. And we read about marches in the major cities. I saw the riot in Bordeaux. I guess some people were even killed in Lyon, or that's what we read. But we thought of this was a Paris thing. This was a Paris thing. Yeah.
So in Poitiers, it didn't go any further than the university being closed down?
No, as I say, of course, because the train workers and the bus workers and the post office system and the trains and the telephone workers went on strike. So, of course, it affected Poitiers. The city closed down. The department stores were even closed down at one point. It's hard to find cheap food. And my landlady very sweetly, nobody else was in town, all the other students had gone, and she very sweetly invited me to have dinner with her each night. She had a little farm somewhere and brought in eggs and vegetables. And, it was the city closed down. But that being said, there was no real evidence of workers, students, consultation, or even of involvement of workers. It just was not an industrial town. And as I think much of, other than people who were in big industrial cities may have had a very different experience than I did. But certainly in Bordeaux, we did see workers. And I'm sure those are workers on the roof of the Hôtel de Ville tossing cobblestones into the place. And you could see some older guys in the front lines with the students when they were charging the CRS. But you didn't see that in Poitiers. Okay.
Another thing that you sort of indirectly mentioned there, that's often talked about when we read about 1968, is this idea of la prise de parole. So this idea that all of a sudden everybody was talking to each other. So is that something that you've experienced, and could you talk to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, as I said, that impressed me enormously, to see everybody talking in the middle of the Boule Miche. They were right out in the middle of the street, gathered in little clumps. Men, and I think women too, were all debating. And, that was a great thing. There was this sense that people were talking to each other in a way they probably hadn't ever done before. And perhaps a lot of people, at least in Paris, were educated. I don't know. They might have been. It's possible. And who knows who these citizens were in their ties and coats, and whether they were already, leftist or socialist. I don't know. But it was quite, that was amazing. And the atmosphere at the Sorbonne was spectacular. Although I think they were mainly students, but you know the story. I'm sure this is well known. That, these group discussions, the groupuscules, were all over the place with debates. I remember one pamphlet I was given. It was by the anarchists. That anarchism is really the highest sense of order. And I tried to figure out what in the world that meant. But everybody was talking, and there was, in Paris, Poitiers, not so much. People were scared outside of Paris, and I should emphasize this. And the people I hitchhiked with were often very uneasy and really scared. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were worried about violence. They were worried about, as in the case of that young soldier, civil war. So there was a both joy, exuberance, and uneasiness, fear combined, as there often is in revolutionary movements. Yeah.
And where do you think that desire to speak and to discuss, where did that come from? Did you try and interpret that?
I don't know. I mean, it was this just general sense of freedom, of liberation that came spread like a wave over everybody, at least in Paris. Things were changing and everybody was hoping for, utopian changes. And certainly on the left or the center left, there was a real hope that the world could be changed and that people should be talking. That part of the problem in the past was that if, a few people had, these were the Trente Glorieuses, the term hadn't yet appeared, and some people were making huge fortunes. France was very wealthy, but it was clear that workers were not eating their fair share, and that the students did not feel they had careers ahead of them. And all of these things now came out in the open, and people were talking about them. Those are the kinds of subjects you hear them talking about in the street, in the middle of the bourniche.
Okay, great. When you think back on this period, do you consider it to have been a violent moment?
Well, it was certainly violent in Bordeaux, and it was violent in the descriptions we heard of the Rue Gay-Lussac and the Latin Quarter and the charging down and the cobblestones and all of those demonstrations, wild demonstrations, quasi riots. Yeah, I thought that was violent. But I didn't see very much of that other than Bordeaux. And I remember above all the long march across Paris and the Sorbonne and the street gatherings and discussion. Yeah. But I do remember it, and I would like to stress that again, that outside of Paris, a lot of people were scared. They were scared. They were nervous, very unhappy. And, that's what showed up in the election, whenever it was it in June or July, that just massive, essentially it was a renunciation for almost everything that movement had stood for, I think, and a massive support for.
And do you think that they were fearful or they were resentful of the movement in Paris?
Well, it probably was a little bit of both, but what I saw and what impressed me was fear. I'd never seen that before in France. There'd always been resentment, a certain amount of resentment towards the Parisians, but to see these waves of fear and uncertainty and anxiety, that was what impressed me.
Okay, so in analyses of '68, particularly more recently, it's become accepted that this wasn't just a French phenomenon, that this sort of wave of revolt was happening in other nations. Was there any sense that what was happening in France then was part of something larger?
Yeah, I think people talked about that a certain amount. As I said, we were already aware of what was going on in Berkeley and Columbia and Germany, Japan, Tokyo, all of these. Yeah, there was this, people talked about this a bit, although the main focus of their complaints, the main focus of their demonstrations and so on were very French. They were mainly thinking of the French situation and what needed to be resolved in France, at least in my experience again.
Okay. Can you recall what you thought of the performance of the political elite at the time? So de Gaulle, Pompidou, Mendes France, Mitterrand.
Well, I didn't, again, for a long time, the television wasn't working. You couldn't see what was going on. We heard some speeches. Eventually, I did see several speeches by de Gaulle. And I don't know, and they were amazing. I suppose you've seen them registered, enregistré, recorded. He was an incredible character, and talk about elitism. You know how in the meetings with journalists, they would all pose a series of questions, and he would shake his head. And after they'd all finished, he gave a speech. And the speech was incredible. It was magnificent. He was a wonderful speaker, but there was this idea that he was so much above it all that he was not answering specific questions. He was just giving a speech. That was the impression of my wife, who was working at CBS News at the time, and went to a couple of his speeches. He was an amazing guy, but he was not exactly a man of the people. I never saw Mendes France or Pompidou, I guess, personally. No. And after, I should say, at the end of my time in Paris, I went back to Poitiers. I took a bus, and at that time, the regular bus system was also closed down, but you could find independent guys with buses at the Esplanade des Invalides, and you went around looking for somebody with a sign in the window up telling you what direction they were going. And so I found one going toward Bordeaux, and that's how I got back to Poitiers. They dumped me off outside the town. I walked back to my residence, and I had to get back because I was about to take a tour with my younger sister. This had been planned, and then part of the problem was that we were out of communications with my family. But at the very last moment, my mother somehow got through on the telephone early one morning and said my sister was still coming, but she wasn't coming to France. She was going to land in Geneva. And I was with, again, my Japanese friend, and we went and picked her up in Geneva and took a tour of Western France. So I was out of the country then for much of the rest of the period. By the time I got back to France, the trains were running again. This had been, I guess, July. And I took her to England and then went off to Germany to study German. So that was the end of my experience. And
what did your family think of you being in France while all this was going on?
They were scared. There was no doubt they were nervous. They tried to talk my sister out of going, and she was very resistant. She had looked forward to this for months. And so that was the compromise they made when my mother was able to change the flight to go into Geneva instead of Charles de Gaulle or Orly, I suppose, at that time. But they were very nervous, no doubt. They were very nervous, as were Americans in general. They didn't really know what was going on. They saw the violence. It was probably exaggerated, I suppose, in the American press. What do I know? I remember at the beginning of this, that was a couple of years earlier, I saw the British coverage of the riots in Los Angeles, my hometown. And it was terrifying, like the whole of American civilization was coming down in ruins. And I can only expect that now the American press was doing much of the same about the French experience. I don't know. Yeah.
And were you able to phone?
No, not for a long time. As I say, no phones wasn't working. The phone system had stopped. And how my mother got through, I don't know. I don't know how my mother got through on that early morning call, or dialing direct or something. I don't know. And only in that way that I was able to go off and pick up my sister in Geneva.
Okay, so you mentioned there that you were away and then you came back and it was finished. So when the events were brought to a conclusion and we get this retour à la normale, if I can say it, what was your sense? Were you disappointed? Were you relieved? Were you wanting more? What was your feeling? How did you feel?
I was frankly relieved. First because it had really disrupted my life and the lives of a lot of people, a lot of students, cut off, couldn't take their exams, had to wait till September to take their exams. Um, and, you know, the whole economy shut down in the little city where I was staying. And I was afraid, after talking with people, I was afraid this could all turn to violence. I was really afraid this could turn to violence. And I think in retrospect, it is quite amazing that there were hardly any deaths in 68. I don't know what the statistics are, but it's my understanding that almost no one was killed. And certainly, despite the violent protests, throwing of cobblestones, the tear gas, the charges, and so on, I don't think anyone was killed. But I was concerned, for sure, that this could be very violent. And I knew only too well what had happened in 48 and 71, and that was not good. This is something that one had to hope could be resolved through constant negotiation. And I think that's partly on the side of the workers. That's exactly what did happen. I don't know that the students were happy, but I think the workers.
And were you able to complete your studies and whatever?
I was not enrolled formally in anything. I was auditing, essentially. The Fulbright in those years, the Fulbright Fellowship for Young Americans, really had no requirements. You could do whatever you wanted to. And I know some of my other fellow Fulbrighters in France just went off and toured the world or just stayed close enough to France to collect their checks. But I was pretty serious, and I audited a lot of courses, especially with Jean Gray, but also some others. Yeah. And of course, that was all disrupted, but it wasn't like I was trying to get a degree. And I went back to graduate school, and my life went on. But the lives of some of those students, my fascist housemate, failed his exams. Whether he would have passed if he could have stayed and if he followed the regular course, but he went home and came back in September and just didn't do very well, and I think ended up going into the army. So it disrupted a lot of people's lives. My life, though, was unchanged pretty much. Went on to graduate school in the United States, went back. And
We'll come on to that in a moment. But when you look at 1968, what do you consider to be the consequences on France of these events? So whether short term, long term, how do you perceive the impact?
Well, as historians, we've all examined this, I think, carefully. In the short term, the universities, there were some important measures taken for the students. They tried to. There was an effort to, as you know, create more universities, maybe make classes smaller, maybe encourage professors to stay in the towns where they were teaching at least a little bit longer, not just overnight. They built lots of universities, but those universities were thrown up overnight, and I'm sure you've gone to some of those places, Toulouse, Le Marais, or the University of Caen, which are disasters. They look like bidonville or something. I mean, they're just they're falling apart. The roof is leaking. There's posters and graffiti everywhere. They just look terrible. So they'd been built too fast, as cheaply as possible. And the professors once again took to staying in Paris, and I don't know. Maybe the changes helped somewhat. In France as a whole, workers got their salaries raised significantly. That was a good thing. But with inflation, I'm not sure how long that lasted. I'm sure you and others have compared it with 36. I'm just not in a position to do that. That's not my thing. But did I see the one thing that I did see and still do see through conversations with my wife was the rise of the women's movement that came out of that. And there was a lot of grumbling and discontent by young women that they had sort of been kept out of the process. They made coffee. They sat on the sidelines and listened. And it was really, I think, my wife thinks that the women's movement, the French feminism really took off after that. And that was a pretty significant change. And the changes in morals, that was one of the revendications of the student, I think, was that sexual revolution. That was part of it. Did make a difference in the freeing of abortion, of birth control, and so on, which did take place. That was a significant change. But on the other hand, I talk to, again, I love to talk to people as hitchhikers. I just meet them wherever. That's something I do as a good historian. It's something we should all do, I think. And talking to some of those people a decade later and seeing how little it changed their lives. I remember the conversation of one young woman, now in her 30s or so, had 3 children. She said, "Oh, I was a Maoist." And I said, "Oh, that changed your life?" She said, "No, it was a fad. It was enthusiasm at the moment. We all forgot it." And she described herself as completely apolitical now. And other people I talked to had moved to the right. We could only feel a little bit cynical about the experience for a lot of individuals that really didn't lead to much. So I don't know, especially at the level of individuals, what was the impact of 68? Certainly wasn't the French Revolution that I studied.
Okay. More about the impact on you. So did you think that your experience of these events had an impact on the way you understand or understood France?
Well, again, I'm a historian of the French Revolution. And when I went back to the United States, I went on with my studies of the French Revolution. I moved more into social history at this time, and became fascinated with the social history of the French Revolution. Whether that was a part of '68 or a part of just growing up, just becoming more mature, or just living in France for a year, not just the '68, talking with people over that long year, I don't know. But many years later, and when I began becoming particularly interested in why people became revolutionaries, which was one of the real puzzling things I dealt with in some of the stuff I was writing. I looked back on those years and thought a lot about the role of emotions in '68. And again, that mixture of extraordinary joy and enthusiasm and hope on the one hand, and the fear and anxiety, and maybe anger on the other, which were all mixed up together, And I thought that was really something revealing for my own understanding of 1789, 1790, 1791, whatever. So in that sense, my experience in '68 did, in the long term, I think, change my views. I became more active when I went to graduate school.
That's my question. Do you think it had any impact on you, sort of personally or politically, afterwards?
Yeah, I became more active. I have to admit, part of it was the American draft system. We were being, and the end of deferrals, the end of the student deferrals for graduate students, and a lot of my friends were being sent off to Vietnam, and I was afraid that this would happen, and I really didn't want that to happen. And I thought about various strategies for avoiding just that. Turn on my computer. So that upset me, and I think that upset my whole generation. And it was this vague of student activism that was in the air in the late 60s and so on. So I don't know how much of that was France and how much that was just a broader life experience. But I did take part then in protests against the war in Vietnam. I joined groups that were going out from Stanford to talk to government officials, municipal officials, trying to explain to them why students were angry, why we were opposed to the Vietnam War. I was not into breaking windows and burning down libraries or anything like that, but I was very much into trying to communicate with the broader public, which seemed not to understand. A lot of them, anyway, did not understand this opposition to the war in Vietnam. And so, yeah, but did that come out of 68? I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe.
And when you get back to the US after 68, were people interested in hearing about your experiences?
Oh yeah. I had lots of conversation with my Stanford professors, for sure. Yeah, oh yeah. We had lots of conversations about it. One thing that was particularly amazing to me, I went into the Hoover Library. The Hoover Library is a library of mainly contemporary world history, or mainly Western history. I don't know what project I was involved with, and I found there were whole lines of boxes along the floor. And I said, what in the world is all this stuff? And they said, oh, those are pamphlets and posters that they had sent a team of people into Paris to pick up all this stuff and bring it back to archive it in the Hoover Library. So if you ever want to, one of the best sources I suspect for looking at 68, and may not have been that much exploited, would be the Hoover Library. And it's like, yeah.
Sounds like a good excuse for a trip.
A great trip to a very nice place of the world, part of the world. Yeah, you should go. So yeah, that was stunning, and everybody had been following this, especially at the level of the university in Stanford, and oh yeah, there was a lot of interest.
Okay, so we're coming towards the end. Last couple of questions. Have you kept an eye, or have you observed the way in which the story of 1968 has been constructed or told over the years?
I really can't answer that now. I mean, that's not my thing. I haven't followed it. I do another period. You'd have to ask my wife about that. Probably has followed. She's the historian of the working class in 19th and 20th century France. Yeah. So, but I was quite, I don't have anything to say about that, I guess. No, I can't really.
The essence of the question is, obviously it's become quite a popular topic of conversation in France. 68 has become this reference point, and I've asked most people who have experienced, anyone I've spoken to who has experienced these events, if the way in which the 1968 is talked about today reflects their own experience of 1968, or has it become, I don't know, romanticized or...
Yeah, you see, I just haven't read enough to gauge whether it's been romanticized or not. I know that there was a big sort of celebration in, what was it, 92 or 93, the 25th anniversary, whenever that was. And I'm sure you remember that, and everybody was talking about it. And that was an interesting moment because my generation was now talking to the younger student generation about their experiences, and comparing notes and thinking about, would there ever be another such movement? And I think it was probably pretty romanticized in a way, but yeah, I'm afraid I can't contribute very much to that issue.
No problem. no problem. Yeah, the commemorations of 68 have become legend almost. I mean,
Yeah.
the 40th anniversary was a huge event, and next year is the 50th anniversary, and yeah, it's probably going to be, it's become almost, you know, this celebration every 10 years, and
Yeah.
almost an industry in itself, which is not without some irony, it must be said. So
But
the last,
those celebrations, those commemorations, once again, and I keep repeating myself, I don't think convey the feeling of fear and anxiety, which I also encountered everywhere, and especially outside of Paris. And I think that may be something that people forget.
okay, great stuff. So one thing, the last thing that I ask everyone to do is, if you were given 30 seconds to summarize your experience of this period, how would you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it was really a total surprise to me, and it did disrupt my life for a while in a pretty significant way, as I've described it. And it is perhaps the single strongest impression I hold from my period as a student. And I wonder, I would later draw on that experience, and have drawn on that experience for understanding of revolution, and particularly the role of emotions, the psychology, the mentalité of a revolution. Yeah, so it was a big deal, especially in retrospect for me personally.
Okay. Is there anything that you wanted to add, or anything that you wanted to discuss that we haven't covered, or is that everything?
I can't think of anything. If you have additional follow-up questions, please feel free to get back to me.
Okay.
Those are the kinds of things I've been thinking about, and
okay,
looking back over my notes and so on.